What do you know about politics? What should you know? Forget views, beliefs, and opinions. Politics is really a science, and that's where we come in. Welcome to Inside Political Science. I'm Kirby Goodell.
I'm Todd Kent, and we're your guides to what's actually happening in politics. We're using our years of experience to navigate political data, media, money, behavior, and more to educate and inform you.
Welcome to Inside Political Science. I'm Kirby Goodell. I'm here with my colleague and good friend Todd Kent, and today we have a special guest with us, Matt Motta. Matt Motta is an assistant professor of health law and policy and management at Boston University, formerly in political science department at Oklahoma State. Some really cool background stuff here that's people like me geek out about, but part of the science of science communication at Annenberg as a postdoc. Also, the title here isn't as revealing as just how cool it is. Part of the Cultural Cognition Project at Yale. Really great work in terms of looking at how people think about the world and how we can communicate more effectively. And part of that is, and part of the reason we have you on, of course, is to talk about your book, Anti-Scientific Americans. We're going to get there, but the first thing we wanted to jump on is we're at 100 days, Todd. What 100 days? I'm so tired. Are y'all tired?
Exhausted.
I have in my notes, this is a really, whatever you think about Donald Trump, and I think we all have opinions, but incredibly ambitious 100 days. Mm-hmm. Also not very strategic in lots of ways, especially like not a legislative agenda. More of just an administrative agenda. Lots of really interesting things going on in terms of what he's trying to accomplish and what his presidential administration has been about.
It's really been an administration. It's all about the executive order. And it's interesting to see how, even though he has a majority in the House and the Senate, so little effort has been gone in there, at least public effort, to kind of move things forward from a legislative standpoint. So it really has been just let's get in the truck and move forward as fast as we can.
Yeah, I think, one of the things that's been lost in kind of these dizzying 100 days is just how much of Project 2025 is being carried out through executive action. Even though some of Project 2025 calls on Congress to take up some of its talking points and legislative ideals, it's pretty much entirely being done through executive action, some of which is lawful and some of which is being challenged in the courts. And that's made for just an absolutely kind of chaotic 100 days, to put it bluntly.
Yeah, and one of the challenges I think he has, if you take him seriously in terms of what he wants to accomplish and what he's trying to do, and you say these are the policy goals, these are the reasons that he got elected, because of the way he's gone about it, and part of it is tied to the ambition, but the other part of it is he hasn't been as successful in achieving his policy goals, in part because he's been heavy-handed in the mechanisms in which he's tried to achieve his policy goals. So we have lots of courts action. We have lots of pushback from groups. And some of it is just purely not about what he's trying to accomplish. Some of it is. You can't do that.
Right. Because in addition to talking about all of these potential policy objectives, whether you agree with them or not, so much of the conversation has been, wait a minute, is that actually allowed to happen? Is this the way that politics really works? And that's taking up a lot of airspace. That's taking up a lot of our mental capacity as well.
It's interesting. I did a little research for a class I was guest lecturing in about the previous efforts to reform government from the executive branch. And there's been 5 to 7, depending on how you count them. So this isn't anything new. It just seems like this is the most recent and kind of the way that it's gone about. And it was in the past, they looked for more incremental change. And This looked like an effort to really make bigger cuts, maybe more abrupt cuts, quicker, and I think it's left people kind of reeling a little bit.
Yeah, the Upshot had a really cool set of graphics. I think they were yesterday, but showing 8 graphs about the Trump administration. And the first couple were the number of executive orders compared to previous presidents. Just an incredible extension in terms of this is governance by executive order. But
Right.
then also the number of lawsuits are just remarkable. So not only is he trying to do things through this administrative path, but everything is being challenged. And it seems like the courts, more than the Congress, more than other institutions, that's where the opposition has to find itself because he's trying to act unilaterally.
Right. I mean, I think tariffs are a perfect example of this. Presidents before have tried to expand tariffs, including Joe Biden,
Yeah.
using executive authority. But what we see going on in the Trump administration is this unprecedented expansion of executive authority to implement new tariffs on countries and in situations that previously wouldn't have been covered under the law. I had a student actually the other day in class tell me, Dr. Motta, it's so interesting that Congress also has the ability to tax. And I was like, my goodness, yeah, that power in theory is reserved to Congress, right? This president has fundamentally changed the way we think about the relationship between us, the Congress, and the executive branch. It's a fundamental reimagining, I think, of how government works.
Yeah.
But don't you think, in a way, this is a trend that started back maybe with Obama and moving forward, where we had the House and Senate are so close, and you can't really do anything. So there was this idea, maybe just through executive order and executive actions, we can start doing some things, and it just has continued to grow, culminating right now where we are with Donald Trump.
Yeah, I think executive action as an alternative to legislative gridlock is something that we've absolutely seen in recent years. And I don't know who started it, right? And I don't know exactly when it kicked off, but I do think it's something that is not going away until we fix this problem, which is that Congress has been, as Kirby rightly noted, very ineffectual, both in this term and in the previous and in the one before that.
And if you're an institutionalist, if you care about this is where you're really troubled because, or at least even on and here I would say on the Republican side as well, you should be troubled because as an institutionalist, if assuming there is a future Democratic president, that's a joke, that Democratic president is going to have an incredible amount of power if Congress as an institution doesn't step up. And right now it seems like the main thing that Congress is doing during this part of the Trump administration is just getting out of his way.
And even giving him some powers he may not have had before, right? We're
Yes.
talking about the possibility that courts' ability to issue injunctions will be taken away, right? Expanding the president's ability to issue tariffs and to tax. I think Congress is putting themselves in a position where if Democrats, win the White House in the next term, if they win back the Congress in the next term, they're going to be in a world of hurt based on actions that they're taking right now. And that's something I don't know the repercussions are being thought about very carefully.
Now, one area we care a great deal about because we're university professors and we have a self-interest in this, of course, is Donald Trump has, and the Trump administration has aggressively been trying to seek greater federal control over universities as political well, we don't want to call a university a political institution as institutions. We may be political, but I don't mean it that way. But as institutions, this is new, right?
Yeah, I've never seen anything like this in my professional life, and it's certainly not something I have much knowledge of happening before. We're seeing grants being canceled. So I think just to take a really quick step back, there is a massive efficiency for the government to say, hey, we care about scientific advances. We need to be able to do research in any number of different fields related to health, related to engineering and physics, right? But it's a lot of work for the government to take this on. Let's contract out with experts at universities to do this work. That's what grant making is all about. And what we've seen the Trump administration doing is unilaterally canceling grants from money that's been appropriated by Congress that touches on subjects that this president doesn't agree with ideologically. That includes canceling money to universities outright. For example, universities that allow transgender athletes to compete in sports. It means canceling research on issues that the administration finds objectionable in some way. And it also means unilaterally renegotiating the indirect payments that universities receive from the government, which is just a fancy way of saying anytime the government makes a grant with a university, the university takes some money to keep the lights on, to pay for Wi-Fi bills, to build labs, to staff labs, et cetera. And look, these are all, all matters of legislation, money that Congress appropriates, indirect rates that are supposed to be a negotiation between the federal government and the university that the Trump administration is unilaterally stepping in and saying, we are canceling, we are taking this money away. Now, of course, this is all being worked out in the courts right now, and we don't know ultimately how it's going to end up. But if the Trump administration is successful, universities like mine, universities like yours are going to lose potentially millions, if not billions, in federal funding. And that impacts not just the people who work here, but everybody who goes to school here and our surrounding communities as well.
Do you think though it's about do you think in the long run it's really about cutting the funding, or is it about controlling how those funds are being used? Is it about power and control, or is it about just reducing the overall amount of funding? Because if you look at various different universities, billions of dollars in federal government support. So someone says, well, if the federal government's giving you all that money, are there strings attached? Are there things you
Right.
have to do? And there
Right.
are, right? But
Sure.
what's do you think this is about reducing the cost, or do you think this is about gaining control?
I think it's about both, right? To be honest, there is some reporting, unverified to this point, but some reporting that the National Science Foundation won't be issuing new grants, will be freezing existing funding. There has been similar reporting at the National Institutes of Health and other agencies within the federal bureaucracy. So it's not just an effort to control what the research is, and that's kind of been the subject of the executive orders up to this point, all about what the universities are spending money on, but also an effort to try to roll back how much is being spent. If the Republicans in Congress are able to pass a budget that looks something like the draft versions of the budget we've seen, the National Institute of Health, for example, could experience up to a 40% cut in its funding. So I do think it's about both. It's both trying to control what academics do, as well as trying to control how much money they have. And one kind of irony here, the way I see it, is that a lot of the rhetoric coming from the Trump administration is that folks who are doing academic research on topics like misinformation are engaging in censorship because we're trying to control the way that people think. I'm happy to talk about examples from my own research where I don't necessarily think that that's the case. But from a broader kind of perspective, if you're telling academics what they can and can't study, isn't that kind of a form of censorship in and of itself? So it's a really interesting position we find ourselves in right now, and we don't know how it'll be resolved, but it's
But you,
confusing.
isn't there, from the public's perspective, people that are listening in that maybe aren't involved in university research, how do we balance this idea that I'm a researcher, I think this is important, and I want you to fund it, and then the government being the main funder, they take the tax dollars and redirect them to universities. Where's the balance there that we need to see to make things work?
Yeah, I think one of the reasons why academics care so much about government funding is because the government is able to take on projects that don't have an immediate or obvious payoff sometimes. Some of the greatest discoveries in the history of medicine are things that happened by accident. The discovery of penicillin, right? The idea that GLP-1s are going to be used for purposes that they weren't originally intended to be used for. These are massive and important discoveries that came about as a result of basic scientific research, where we don't always have an exact claim or an exact conclusion at which we think we're going to arrive, which say serves some type of profit motive. That's why it's so important for us to work with the government, because they might be willing to take on projects that the private sector might not be willing to take on if the payoff isn't immediately obvious. I think what we need to do as scientists is communicate the value of basic research and to make the case for why the government should be involved in doing it. Because ultimately, this is research that benefits all of us and makes our lives better. I don't know how it is that we can convince this particular presidential administration that that's the case, but I do think that that is a message that people can send to their members of Congress who are in charge of controlling appropriations for scientific research. If there are certain things that Congress wants to prioritize, it can make that clear in the legislation that it passes to appropriate those funds. So to me, that's kind of the answer, is that this is one that fundamentally rests in the legislature.
Yeah, one of the real challenges, and I'm glad you mentioned that, is this idea of basic research, because some people will say, well, just let industry do it. If there's a payoff, industry will fund the research. But that, as you know, and I think sometimes this isn't a message we communicate well enough outside of a university setting. A lot of the research that is being funded is research that's not going to have that immediate payoff, that needs some time to develop, and the payoff is going to be 5 years out, 10 years out, 20 years out. We don't really know when the payoff is going to come. And in fairness, in some of it, there may be no payoff, but it will lead to something else. So that's part of it. Another part of it, though, is a lot of the research that's being done, there really are important implications for that work, right away. And so I think one of the challenges in terms of the politics of this, are our legislators, our representatives really going to want to cut research that makes people healthier and more prosperous? And isn't that a losing argument at some point?
I think that there is some growing opposition, even from within the president's own party, in the legislature. So I can give you an example of Senator Britt from Alabama. Her state oversees a massive university health system at the University of Alabama at Birmingham. This is a university health system that not just does lots of scientific research, right? But it also treats a lot of people that live in the area. This is not just about producing life-saving research, which they are, but it's literally about saving lives. If that university system loses money, the people who depend on its hospitals are not going to be able to get care. And so Senator Britt, nobody is going to accuse Senator Britt of not being a Trump supporter, right? She is a loyal Trump supporter, but she has reservations about this. And so I think that if folks are worried about the idea that basic research could go away, the research that gave us GPS, the research that gave us the internet, right? If people are worried about this research going away, it's the legislative route that they need to pursue. It's more about talking to your members of Congress and letting them know, why you're concerned. But I think that one of the really big challenges here is that the public doesn't necessarily know, and we as scientists have not done a good job communicating how much research benefits the people who don't just work in the universities, but the surrounding community. And one of the things that I try to do as somebody who studies the science of science communication is to think about how can we as scientists have more productive conversations with the public to make this point clear. And that's something I'm happy to talk about throughout our time together today.
Yeah, maybe when we come back, we can discuss that a little bit. I think sometimes the scientific community, the public perceives some of the things that are going on, and it's easy to kind of to pick on as being political and ideological. And we get away from the discussions about the basic research that's changing healthcare and lives, and we focus on the political and ideological things. And I think that's where we get into the scientific community gets in trouble, because they make themselves kind of easy targets for the political opposition.
And also the challenge of communicating that this research is good for you whether or not you are part of the university establishment. Universities have real world economic impact. They're valuable to their communities. They make their communities better. The research that they're doing makes their community, provides jobs that we don't normally think of maybe as research jobs that are really important to those communities. When we come back, we're going to talk more about your book, Anti-Scientific Americans, and how to best communicate science and reestablish trust in science and indirectly maybe universities. We'll be right back.
Want more content from KAMU? Find us on our YouTube channel. Turn on exclusive videos anytime, anywhere. Live stream Texas A&M events. Watch interesting stories plus full episodes of Inside Political Science, Brazos Matters, Gigs, Texas A&M Today, and so much more. Listen, learn, discover. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at KAMU Public Broadcasting.
Hi, I'm Bill Clark, the host of But Beautiful, where each week I share jazz music that's important to me because it's swinging and historically important, but beautiful. I've been on an extended sabbatical, but I'm back and excited to share new music with you in a new format. Please join me Wednesday from 7 to 9 p.m. on Aggie Lands Public Radio, 90.9 KAMU FM.
We're back. We're back with our guest, Matt Motta. Todd, one of the things that we were talking about, one of the... And in your book, one of the sort of interesting findings is there's maybe always been a group of Americans who are distrustful of science, and maybe always is too strong. So you can clarify that for us. But being skeptical of science isn't necessarily new, right?
No, and it's not even necessarily a bad thing. So here's one of the things so my book, Anti-Scientific Americans, I track public opinion toward the scientific community, not just scientific research, but the people who do it, from the 1940s to present. And one of the things I find in the book is that at any given point in time, somewhere between 1 in 4 to 1 in 3 Americans holds negative views toward the people behind the science. And for most of American history, at least since I've been able to track it in public opinion polling, Democrats and Republicans have been pretty similar with respect to how they feel about scientists. There was a time, not all that long ago, that Republicans held higher levels of trust in the scientific community than Democrats, in part because of our response to the Cold War and government investment in military technology that was done by scientists. But that has changed dramatically today. And one of the things that I show in the book is that right around the rise of the Tea Party, the Taxed Enough Already party for some of the younger listeners, that arose in response to Obama's first term in office, that politicization really started to take off, such that today Democrats tend to hold more positive views toward the scientific community than Republicans. There's a lot of folks who attribute this polarization to the COVID-19 pandemic. One of the things I argue is that it's actually much older than that, but that the COVID-19 pandemic accelerated it. But let's go back to skepticism, right? I think skepticism is a really important thing. Skepticism is at the heart of what we do every day. Every scientist who's submitted a paper for peer review and been rejected, or who has had a grant not get funded, knows how much it hurts to be rejected. But this is also such an essential part of science. We always begin from the premise that we're wrong. And then we quantify the possibility that we might be right. We are skeptics, and people who have skepticism toward the scientific community are probably doing really good science, right? It is important to be skeptical. But what is so alarming to me is that healthy skepticism of any one particular scientific finding has been replaced by a blanket skepticism of the scientific community writ large. If it comes from a university, it must be bad. And that heuristic, that kind of shortcut that has come to pervade the way that some members of the public think about science is really shaping our politics and our policy in the ways that we talked about earlier in our conversation. So many of the interruptions in scientific research are things that are not just going to impact the work that we do, but that are going to impact scientists personally. You know, when you have folks in the administration seeing that they want to see scientists and civil servants and bureaucrats in trauma, right? That is an attack on not just science, but the people who do the science. So that's why I wrote the book, and that's what I wanted to think more about in the book.
Yeah, I was looking up some the past news. You alluded to the COVID times as being a major driver of this, and maybe it existed beforehand. at that time in the Biden administration, the CDC director Rochelle Walensky came out and said that if you get the vaccine, you will not get sick and you can't transmit it. And it was obvious that wasn't true. I mean, people could see around them that they knew everybody that gotten the vaccine that had COVID, so maybe they didn't get sick. But I mean, is it activities like that or misspoken pronouncement from somebody that's really important? Do you think that has increased this drive towards skepticism of science?
Sure. Absolutely, right. I think it's important for us to recognize that some of the people who led the COVID-19 response got things wrong, right? The scientists aren't perfect. I would also say that it's one thing to look back on a pandemic, and it's another thing to govern during a pandemic, and that often we are acting on incomplete information, right? And so to send clear signals to the public sometimes means putting nuance aside. And when that nuance gets thrown aside, it is easy to have egg on your face later on when some of those things don't come to pass. My understanding of the way that the CDC and others handled the COVID-19 pandemic was essentially to say, let's imagine that this is the worst case scenario. What would we do under a worst case scenario? And that led to some decisions that were really smart, prudent ones, and it led to some that were not so smart in hindsight. And I think that we as a scientific community, and someone like me who studies infectious disease and vaccines, we need to admit what we got wrong and own up to it and try to do better next time. And I'll be the first to say, we did get things wrong.
Do you think there is a challenge, though, between the sort of the science communication part of it, especially if the goal of the communication is to get people to behave in a particular way versus the fundamental nature of science, right? And you I thought you put it really nicely. We start with the assumption that we're wrong, and then we gather evidence and we say, hey, the evidence looks like we might be right. A lot of people who aren't, as deeply embedded in sort of scientific understanding, they don't always understand. They're like, last week they told us to not eat eggs. Now they're telling us to eat eggs. They told us wine was good for us, and now it's bad for us, and we should, and so there's stuff like that I think best available evidence leads us to one conclusion at one particular time. But there's when you move beyond that, sometimes there's the urgent need to get people to act that may make the politics unhelpful to the science?
Right. I mean, the science communicators, people who actually go out there and try to tell the public, here's what science has found, here's what here's how you ought to act on it, right? We're always thinking about how we can use cutting edge tools from social science and from other disciplines to communicate better. And I think that, one of the things that scientists often get wrong is that we begin from the premise that we're having a fight about the facts. That if people disagree with us, it's because they don't know the facts. And if only they were to be presented with the facts, they would change their mind. And that comes from a position where we assume that people who hold opinions at odds with the science are stupid, that they don't read, that they don't know the science. And that is so often not true. What we know from social science research is that it's often the case that people who hold opinions at odds with the science know a heck of a lot about the science. I use this example in class all the time, but if you want to know something about the curvature of the Earth, you should ask a flat earther about interplanetary geology, right? They know all of this stuff because you have to believe that the world is flat, right? You need to have this specialized knowledge. If we as scientists begin from the premise that the people we're talking to don't know what we're talking about, we're not going to have productive conversations with them. I think the best thing that we can do as science communicators is make an effort to understand why some people don't accept the facts and have a conversation on terms that are amenable to both of us. Now, I use this example in some of our research that we've done in the past, but there's a lot of people who are averse to vaccinating, not because they don't understand how vaccines work, but because they're afraid of needles. They're afraid of putting foreign substances into their body. They understand basic immunology, perhaps, but they don't necessarily want to put a foreign substance into their body. So we try to engage with people on their own terms and say, hey, we get it. Putting a foreign substance into your body through a syringe is something that's inherently scary. But Microbes that can infect your body and do harm to it are also foreign invaders that threaten your bodily sanctity, right? And we have those conversations with people. We find that we're effective at changing the way that people think about the science. But that comes from a place of empathy and understanding. I'm not telling us we need to put the facts aside, but I am saying I think that scientists need to do a better job understanding where opposition comes from and then talking about the science in a way that is mutually beneficial for both of us.
Todd, when we were preparing for this, we were talking. RFK Jr. was just here with Brooke
Right.
Rollins, who's an
Yeah.
former Texas A&M graduate, Aggie in the Department of Agriculture. But RFK Jr. One of the things that, to your point, I think sometimes when he's criticized, he's people miss the part of the story that he gets right, because he's
Mhm.
getting part of the story right. Maybe not, in my
Right.
opinion, and this is an opinion and a sort of editorial comment on it. He's getting only part of the story right, but not the whole story, right? And so part of what you're talking about there, I think, is yeah, sometimes we do have to take more control over health. Sometimes there is a criticism that's fair,
Yeah.
and it's not just completely misinformation or
Sure.
misinterpreted, and so we have to deal with those criticisms on the we maybe the pharmaceutical industry sometimes does want us to take more medicine than we should, right?
Well,
And
yeah. I mean, here's an example where Kennedy is both partly right and both partly wrong about something. We as scientists do not know where autism comes from. We feel very confident that vaccines are not the cause of autism, and we
right,
can talk about why it is we think we know that. But that doesn't mean we understand where autism comes from. So when Kennedy launches an initiative to try to understand the causes of autism, I mean, I applaud that general effort. I think that's something we need to do. And I think a lot of scientists should applaud it. But there's something that Kennedy's doing that to me is just not consistent with how the scientific method ought to operate, which is that he's promising to find a cause by a certain date. This idea that by September we will know the cause of autism is not how science works. Going back to the original idea that people should be skeptical of the work that we do, this is an example where science for Kennedy is arriving at a conclusion before the science has been done. We need to entertain the possibility that we might be wrong and that we might not come up with a definitive conclusion here. And so to me, this is something that Kennedy is both doing well in terms of the focus that he has, but the science doesn't feel like it's being carried out appropriately. And I think we need to interrogate those claims when they come from anybody who claims to know for certain the answer to the way the world works.
Isn't this the inherent danger here? Is that I was talking to Kirby about John Barry's book, The Great Influenza, and how he made the statement: when science meets politics, you get politics. And,
Right.
and then that a lot of what we see going on is that we want the science to dominate and we need to talk about the merits of the science, but what
Right.
happens is it ends up being it ends up being political, and that's what that's what we argue about on a daily basis.
That's such a fascinating question because essentially it's asking, does the science come to the politics or does the politics come to the science? And I think that oftentimes it can go in both directions. Some of the grants that are being canceled today are about subjects that people didn't know would be politically controversial. The idea that reducing health inequities would be something that the government would not prioritize in 2025 is something that health inequity researchers probably didn't think about when they were starting their research agenda in 2010 or 2015 or whatever the case may be, right? So sometimes the politics comes to the science irrespective of what the scientists want. But it's so fascinating that you mentioned influenza and the influenza pandemic of over a century ago, because the way that I begin the book, Anti-Scientific Americans, is with a story about a scientist walking down the street who had recommended in public that people wear masks during an infectious disease outbreak and had been spit on, had rocks thrown at him, and the like. And I kind of try to lead folks to believe that this is a story from the COVID-19 pandemic because it's one that is very familiar to us, but it's actually from the great influenza pandemic of over a century ago. We've been here before. The way that the public thinks about scientists and the people who do the research has been very controversial in the past. And part of that might be because about what the scientists are doing, but part of it might be about the politicians coming to the science. In today's hyper-polarized age, where Democrats and Republicans agree on almost nothing, anytime a politician weighs in on a scientific issue, we tend to see public opinion split. Once Republicans and Democrats in Congress, in Washington, and the presidential administration hold differing views, the public then sorts on the basis of their preferred partisanship, even if those issues had not been controversial before. We're seeing this play out right now with respect to water fluoridation and whether or not we ought to be putting fluoride in the drinking water, something that was not controversial a few years ago that is now deeply divisive today. And I think we'll see it play out with respect to a lot of other science-related issues as well in the coming years.
Yeah, one of the things that you hit on here, I think that's really interesting is, well, a couple of things. One is just the idea. I think the public, a little bit of the frustration on the public is the idea that the experts know what is best for them, right? And so there's a sort of natural populist response to this. But
Right.
recognizing that populist response to that, it seems to me that, and if there's something that's different about today than in the past, the willingness of maybe partisan elites to jump on that and to use that as a way of attacking the expertise and the science behind, because they recognize that there's either a direct political gain for it, or on an issue that they really care about, a policy that they care about, they find it useful to question the experts who are out there making claims about how the world works.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there's definitely a relationship between the way that people feel about experts and populist sentiments more generally. And look, I think a lot of us, maybe even folks who are, listening to this show right now, would consider themselves to be populists, who maybe also hold positive views towards scientists and the scientific community, right? These two things don't necessarily have to cut against one another. What I think we need to recognize is that our contemporary world is so difficult for us to understand, is so technologically complicated. My Wi-Fi goes down, I'm not fixing that. My air conditioner breaks, yeah, like good luck. I need to find someone to help me with this. Our modern world is very technically complex. And while all of us may have expertise in one thing, very few of us have expertise in everything. And so what experts who are doing work like in medical fields, right, in geophysical fields and the like, experts who work in university settings and related industries, they need to make the case our expertise is useful and we are going to be able to share information in a productive way. There are plenty of populists who do not hold negative views toward the scientific community. One of the things that I actually talk about in the book is this idea that on the populist left, we've almost seen a reification of people in the scientific community, right? Like holding these people up to very lofty standards. So populism and anti-intellectualism don't necessarily have to go together. And one of the ways that we as scientists can make sure that that doesn't happen is to say, look, all aspects of our life, whether we want it to or not, involves some amount of expert input. Here's why you should accept ours. And part of that means being intellectually humble, and part of that means, trying to understand what people are thinking and why they hold the beliefs that they do.
No, that's a great point. And I think as you start looking at how do you move forward from this kind of rut we're in, where people are so skeptical and it's so political. I think about Texas A&M, and we have our agricultural extension service has experts in 254 counties in Texas. That's every county. And so if you're a farmer and you're having trouble with an insect or some kind of disease, you go to the experts, and nobody questions it. Nobody considers that to be political at all. It's just accepted in Texas. And so I think how do we get there, other than you mentioned messaging? We need to be better messengers. But what do you think what's the roadmap towards a better future?
Yeah, this is such a great question. And this is what I talk about with scientists probably the most of any topic. And, unfortunately, I don't think there's any one blueprint, because if we really want to understand why people don't accept science or why science has become politically controversial, that means understanding these specific reasons why some people reject science and why others don't. And so that means we can't have a single blueprint for addressing everybody. And that's okay, because we have plenty of tools in our toolkit to be able to have more productive conversations about the science. I think one of the absolute best things we can do is elevate the stories of people who we might ordinarily consider to have opinions at odds with the best available science, who nevertheless support the science for some reason. So, for example, skeptics who see the light, vaccine skeptics who chose not to vaccinate, who then regret not vaccinating when they get sick. These folks are incredibly powerful communicators of the science. We show this in our research, in part because they immediately establish trust with skeptical audiences by saying, hey, you and I agree on something. We both, at some point in our life, didn't think vaccines were safe and effective. But here's why I regret not vaccinating, and here's why you should vaccinate as well. I think trying to find examples of those folks who have kind of made a pivot of some kind is really helpful. And when it comes to the attacks on science that we see, coming from the Trump administration, I think it makes a lot of sense to elevate the stories of people like Senator Britt, who say, look, I'm a loyal Trump supporter, but I'm really worried that these cuts are going to impact whether or not my constituents have access to hospital care that we need. And that to me is a really productive way. That implies some amount of partisan agreement in Washington and among all of us. But look, while science is extremely divisive today, it doesn't mean that there aren't some areas of common ground, like the Brit example demonstrates. And so I'm hopeful that when we find those stories and try to elevate them, that we can ultimately get people to side with the science.
There's also maybe a bigger, broader, right? The one of the reasons the U.S. Is a dominant world power is the scientific enterprise, right? And that goes beyond. I'm not just talking military here, though. Of course, military is part of the story, and technology, but also economics, also health, quality of life, all the things that science has done. Putting an investment in this has yielded this benefit.
Right.
And so at least one of the fears that you have to have if you're thinking about some of this is, are we undermining our own future as a global power, or just in terms of the quality of life in our local communities?
Absolutely. I mean, we're seeing, countries around the world starting to prepare packages to get ready to hire scientists away
Yeah.
from the United States. And I'm really, really worried that people aren't going to recognize what we had until it's gone. That so much of our ability to, consider ourselves to be one of the, if not the most technologically advanced nation in the world, comes from our investment in basic science research. And that all could go away. And I think what we need to do, again, as scientists, is to not assume on the basis of faith that people assume that funding scientific research is a good thing. We need to talk about what scientific research has done
Yeah.
for people, right? I have heard so much in the past couple of weeks, first 100 days, right, of Trump presidency, about attacks on science, about whether or not they're lawful, about money being taken away. I have heard so much less about people talking about how basic investment in science gave us the internet that we're using to have this call right now, gave us the GPS that we use to be able to navigate around wherever it is that we live, right? Gave us penicillin, gave us all sorts of treatments that we may not have understood at the time were going to make our lives better. How government investment in science is making our lives better is something that I just don't think we've had enough of a conversation about. And that to me is one, a function of the fact that we're talking about so many things. It's hard for anything to get airspace right now. But if you're a scientist listening to this and you happen to be having a conversation with someone who doesn't think the work you do is important, maybe have a conversation about why you think it is that your work has contributed something valuable to that person's life. I know that every single scientist believes that the work they do makes the world better in some way. Otherwise, they wouldn't do it, right? I don't think we'd want to be in this position if that was what we believe. So, have that conversation with people. I think that's a really important thing that's missing right now.
And I know Texas A&M is doing this. I know lots of universities are starting to do this. Like, what is, if we lose funding for this project, what is the impact? How can we communicate that to people so that people understand this means this has a consequence for disease. This has a consequence for energy production.
Right.
This has a consequence for how well we're governed. We can
Right.
just go down the line of things that research can affect, and if the funding is cut, how it has those consequences. But I think that's probably where we're heading, right? Where we have to be better communicators about this.
I worked 14 years overseas with U.S. universities, and I still think that the greatest export we have, or the greatest draw that we have, is our higher education.
Yeah.
Where other countries are catching up when it comes to undergraduate work, with the graduate work, with research, we're still so far ahead. If you want to be a major world researcher, you go to the U.S. And,
Right.
I would hate to lose that.
Yeah.
So I do think we're in a position where we have to do better job of messaging, better job of explaining, and and this message has to go not only to the public, but I think to the political world, that this matters and this is not political. And if it is political, we need to talk about whether it's something that we need to be pursuing at this time, because there is so much work that needs to be done.
And
Right.
to,
You're absolutely right.
Oh, and to your point, Matt, I think if a Katie Britt recognizes, or any legislator, any senator, any representative recognizes that they're going to be hurt if their local university is hurt, or if the funding for projects that help their local community are hurt, there's going to be pushback eventually.
Yeah, and let me even put it in political science terms, right? Even if we put aside altruistic motives about what good research does and who's going to be hurt, re-election chances, right? Our members of Congress care about being re-elected. And if they think they're going to be punished at the polls for not taking action to defend science, then they may step in and do it. But here's the problem. My colleagues and I just came out of the field of the poll, where we asked the public about many different ways in which science and scientific research has been interrupted in the first 100 days of the Trump presidency. These data are not peer-reviewed yet. They'll hopefully be out somewhere at some time, so feel free to take this with a grain of salt. But here's what we find. Very, very few Americans support what the Trump administration is doing. But most Americans don't really care, right? These are issues that seem pretty esoteric to people, that it's not that there's a lot of support for what he's doing, but there's also not a lot of opposition to what he's doing. Most people are somewhere in the middle saying, I hadn't really thought about this before, right? I hadn't thought about what would happen if universities lost funding. That needs to change. And that's where universities can help out. I think that when universities talk about what impact budget cuts are going to have on not just the university, not just the research, but the community that depends and that works symbiotically with the university, that to me is going to help get the public to care about it. And those messages need to, as you both rightly noted, have some kind of a call to action, right? We can freak people out with the communications we have. We can make people afraid. How do they then channel that energy into something productive? And this is my personal view here. So this is an opinion from me. To me, it is call your member of Congress. Those are the people who have the ability to enact legislation that specifically appropriates funding to help out the cause that you believe in. So if that's something that matters, I think that's what people need to do.
We need to wrap it up. We need to let you go. We've taken a lot of your time, but we want to give you kind of the last word here, and especially because one of the things that I hope comes through in this conversation, we're dealing with a lot of complex, difficult topics, but you always seem so optimistic that we're going to fix the problem. Is that fair? Or am I just reading too much optimism into you?
I am optimistic about it. The thing that I care the most about is using science to have more productive conversations about science. I and my colleagues are always trying to find new ways to communicate more efficiently, to have better conversations with people. I believe at the end of the day that we're all on the same team, that we want the same things, and that we may just disagree about how to get there. So how can we communicate from a place of empathy and shared understanding? I think it's hard to do, but I also think that at the end of the day, it's something we're all capable of doing. And frankly, if I didn't believe it, my job would be a heck of a lot less fun than it is. So I choose to believe that we're going to be able to fix this problem. Maybe not today, but soon.
Well, Matt, I wish we had another hour to talk. Thank you so much for your time. To our audience, if this is your first time listening, click the subscribe button so you never miss an episode. Thank you for joining us. Thank you again, Todd. Always such a great conversation.
Thank you for having me. This is such a great podcast.
Thank
you. Inside Political Science is a production from KAMU, Aggieland's Public Television and Radio. For more information, visit tx.ag/insidepoliticalscience. Have a question for our experts? Email them at insidepolicy@tamu.edu. Also, subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast platform so you never miss a new episode.